What's going on, everyone? Welcome to the Tuesday, December 12th or 10th edition of the Ship My Money Show. I'm your host, Adam Scherer. You can follow me on Twitter at ShipMyMoney DFS. Only a two-game NBA slate tonight, two NBA Cup games, so should be a fun one, at least from a viewing standpoint. And then obviously, if we make some money, it'll be fun from a DFS standpoint too. Wasn't sure if I was going to do this show. Joseph in chat said, Adam, putting in work with the two-game show. I see you. I was kind of on the fence about it, but I think it's a pretty fun one to talk about. There's a lot of stuff to dig into. I am going to attempt to show some stuff from Popcorn Machine that I found interesting when I talk about Orlando as well. Not sure if I'll succeed in that, but going to try. So I thought it was a pretty interesting slate. I probably will do the two-gamer tomorrow too. Didn't do yesterday, so felt like I should do today also. But I'm going to walk through how I would be playing large field DraftKings tournaments as well. Obviously, on a two-gamer, you can also make the case for being a little bit more contrarian than usual, caring more about raw ownership just from a dupe standpoint if you are playing the massive field, 100K to first tournament, because dupes are going to be a thing. So I sort of have that factored in here. There are dupes in the field, that I projected to play against. But you could also go a little bit further. I was kind of messing around before the show, looking at lineups, like what happens if I really heavily penalize lineups that are really, really popular. But I didn't want to show those on the show because I probably wouldn't actually be playing them, and there's a decent chance it would just be bad advice. It's not something I've really tested out too much since there's not too many massive field two-game slates that we have to worry about. So pretty similar approach for me as far as the lineups I'd be playing. But again, did factor dupes in somewhat, at least in the how I project the field that I'm playing against to play. But it is an interesting slate. There are a couple of, but both rotations in the first game have question marks and missing or adding pieces, depending which team you're talking about. For Orlando, you don't have Franz Wagner in addition to not having Banchero. We have one game that we can look at and see how Orlando handled those rotations. Jonathan Isaac also questionable. He didn't play in that game, so that would change things too. For Milwaukee, you've had Chris Middleton back for two games. So, kind of trying to read into how they're handling that rotation and how that's going to play out going forward. And then for Dallas, you do have a couple Q tags there. Najee Marshall, questionable. He's missed the last couple of games. PJ Washington, questionable. I projected those guys in for now, but that would change things a bit if they end up being out. And then OKC, pretty straightforward at this point as far as injuries go, but it is OKC, so it's never really that straightforward because Dagnall changes his rotations constantly. You do have Alex Caruso, too, who's only been back for a couple of games. So there's a lot to dig into, a lot to talk about. Starting with the Orlando side here as underdogs in Milwaukee. Again, playing with no Paolo Banchero, playing with no Franz Wagner. And I'll start by just going through my player exposures, and then I will dig in. Actually, I'll start with the rotations here because I think it'll probably make more sense to kind of talk about how I'm expecting Orlando to play this based on what we saw in their last game without Franz against Phoenix. And then from there, go into how that leads to the player exposures I'd be getting to. So going to attempt to switch over to Popcorn Machine for a second and show that. So anybody not familiar, this is Popcorn Machine. Highly recommend using it if you are digging into any of this stuff by yourself. It's a free site. You can see player rotations from every game. You can see the game flow here. So like sometimes if you're just looking at a box score, you'll get the idea that, somebody didn't play a lot of minutes, and you might not realize that it's because like the second unit stayed out there because they were on, a 20-0 run or something. So you can see that kind of stuff here. Like here you had a 19-7 Orlando run, but I pulled it up just because, this is, I think, a really important game to look at because it is the game that we have without Wagner. It's kind of all that we have to go by. So starting at the center position, the first thing that stands out here, and I think it's a pretty big thing because it is something we've seen for most of the season as well. Now, keep in mind, Phoenix is a different matchup than Milwaukee. Phoenix, you can see here, you had Plumlee starting, you had Iguodaro coming off the bench. They weren't playing them alongside each other. So you had a smaller Phoenix team than you do Milwaukee, where you're going to have Giannis playing alongside Brolo, also Bobby Portis in the mix there in the front court. So bigger Milwaukee front court. So that is a difference, and I'll get to that. But when you look at the center rotation here, you had Goga start as usual, Mo Wagner backing him up. And we've had Mo Wagner's playing time be all over the place this season where, some games he plays 28 minutes, other games he plays 17. He played 17 and a half in this one. The big takeaway for me looking at this was that Wagner acted as the strict backup to Goga, despite it being a game where Wendell Carter Jr. only played 21 minutes, and it being a game where you were missing Jonathan Isaac, in addition to Banchero and Wagner. There were a ton of minutes available for Mo Wagner alongside Goga if Orlando had wanted to go that route and play bigger. Now, again, Phoenix is a smaller front court, so there is a chance that maybe Orlando does do that here against the Milwaukee front court as opposed to that game against Phoenix. But overall this year, Mo Wagner has barely played alongside Goga, like 8 total minutes, 17 total possessions. So when I projected this one, I went 48 minutes total to Wagner plus Goga. I went 28 minutes to Goga. I went 20 to Wagner. I think that Wagner still has the ability to play a lot of minutes. It probably just comes at the expense of Goga if that happens. I think it's less likely that you just get a rotation change here where he plays a bunch of minutes alongside Goga, even though this is a matchup where, again, that could happen. It's just not super likely based on what we've seen Orlando do so far this season. So that was the first thing that stood out. The second thing is that Carter only played 21 minutes, which obviously is less than you expect from him. I projected him still for 28 tonight. And part of that is the matchup here against the bigger front court with Giannis and Lopez and Portis. When you look at the first half rotation, it was, I think, a more normal rotation for Wendell Carter. He played like 14 and a half total minutes in the first half. And then here in the second half, just didn't come back. But what stood out here was that Caleb Houston was essentially Wendell Carter's backup for the normal rotation minutes. You can see Carter subs out, Houston subs in, Houston subs out, Carter subs in, same thing for the rest of the half. And then here, Houston, again, the first guy in, subbing in for Carter. I think some people might look at that and say, like, Caleb Houston's the first guy off the bench now with Wagner out. I don't think that's the case. Maybe it is. I look at it more as just he was subbing in for Carter. If Isaac is in today, I think Isaac is taking most or all of these Caleb Houston minutes. Again, that could be wrong. If it is wrong, what probably happens is that it's really bad for Cole Anthony because Isaac plays like these Caleb Houston minutes, but Caleb Houston stays in the rotation and steals like Cole Anthony minutes. That could happen. It's not what I think happens. So I projected Isaac to play like 16 minutes, again, basically backing up Carter. And then that leaves 4 minutes to go to like Tristan da Silva or something. So that's how I projected that if Isaac is in. If Isaac is out, I think you see a similar rotation here where Caleb Houston is playing the non-Wendell Carter minutes. Tristan da Silva only played 19 minutes in this one. As a starter this year, he has actually averaged like 26 or 27 minutes per game. So I do think that there is the potential for him to play more minutes. I still only projected 22 just because of the fact that Cole Anthony and Anthony Black both got minutes over him in that last game. So I still went a couple more minutes than he played against Phoenix, but I still didn't go the full like 26 or 27 that you could potentially get if he just gets some run over, say, Cole Anthony, which certainly could happen, has been happening for a lot of the season. Obviously, they play different positions, but you can slide Jalen Suggs and Kentavious Caldwell-Pope each down a position. So I think that, again, you have some volatility in the rotations here, but we can see that you basically just had like direct subs for the most part in this Phoenix game. And that is something that Orlando typically does a pretty decent amount of, is just having like direct backups to people as opposed to moving guys around a lot. There was some of the moving guys around, but not as much as you potentially could have had. And that stands out here with Tristan da Silva as well. When you see that Cole Anthony was essentially subbing in for him directly in the first half, Cole Anthony played every single minute that actually for the game, Cole Anthony played every single minute that Tristan da Silva was not on the floor. You end up getting a 29-minute game from Cole Anthony. Now, I only projected 20 minutes to Anthony today. And the reason, there's two things. One, like I said, I went a few minutes higher to Tristan da Silva at 22 minutes. We know that Cole Anthony has been playing a bit more lately, but we've also seen him really be out of favor for the most part this season in Orlando's rotation. So I wasn't comfortable just saying, okay, Franz Wagner is out, Anthony plays a ton of minutes, although it does make sense for him to play more with Wagner out because you need scoring somewhere now. We really haven't seen a lot of times this season where Anthony's scoring has been needed because you've had Franz Wagner out there. You have Suggs who can score some, obviously plays well defensively, KCP, solid defensive player. Now with Wagner out along with Banchero, you do have a bigger role for Cole Anthony. So I do still have 20 minutes going to him here. But the big differences for me, the way I see it, are that, again, I think De Silva probably plays a couple more minutes on average, but also I think Carter gets to those like 28 minutes. And I think that probably comes out of Cole Anthony because what I think really changes is that Carter gets a closing shift here. And so you probably get a closing lineup where it's KCP, Jalen Suggs, Wendell Carter, and then one of Goga or Wagner. And then that only leaves one spot for Cole Anthony or Anthony Black or Tristan Da Silva or whoever. Black, has been playing ahead of Anthony pretty much all season long. I think it's a little bit more likely that Black closes. So I ended up at 24 minutes for Black. I ended up at 20 minutes for Anthony. There is a lot of volatility there. Cole Anthony is still a good play. He's really cheap. But that is my takeaway basically on how this Orlando rotation went in the Phoenix game, how I think it's going to change for the Milwaukee game based on the size Milwaukee has in their front court, who I think Orlando's likely to play, and then the substitution patterns that we saw from Orlando in that last game. So just because I think some of these guys are going to play a little bit less doesn't necessarily mean they're bad plays, especially on a 2-game slate. And I'll get into that now, switching back over to my player exposures, but just kind of wanted to show that on the screen because it made things a little bit easier than just trying to talk through all of that without pointing to any of it. So getting back to Orlando here, Goga is showing up a lot for me at 5,400. I forgot to load my projected minutes in here, but I projected him for 28 minutes. I think that's a little bit higher than the industry went, but it just goes back to what I was saying on the previous screen, where I think you're getting 48 minutes here from Goga plus Wagner combined. I went to 20 minutes on Wagner. I don't really feel comfortable going higher than that. We just saw Goga play 31 or 30 and a half minutes, against Phoenix. We've seen him get up in that range in games that are competitive where he's not in foul trouble. Going to 28 seemed really reasonable. Going to 20 against Wagner seemed reasonable. I do think that you could see some more Wagner out here. In the past, not necessarily even with Orlando. I can't remember specifically with Orlando. I know with Washington, he was the guy that they just kind of like to use against bigs like Giannis, where they would just throw him out there, try and draw some charges, try and get under, the opposing big skin. Maybe you see some of that here. But again, 20 minutes for Wagner, I think is a very reasonable projection. And it does make him look decent at 5K. But if you're giving those other 28 minutes to Goga at 5,400, it makes him look good there as well. Getting 31% ownership, but I'm basically 2x the field. And another reason that I am relatively confident that you get 48 minutes barring blowout run from those two guys is just think about like what Orlando would be doing if they don't do that. If they just start giving Wendell Carter Jr. minutes at the 5, which they could, it would just be weird in this spot because then you're just playing smaller against a bigger Milwaukee team. They didn't even do that last game against Phoenix, and you'd be doing it to basically give Goga / Wagner minutes to more of like Tristan Da Silva, Cole Anthony, Jet Howard, guys like that, Anthony Black, where they could do it, but it just seems like a pretty unlikely matchup for them to do it. So I went 48 minutes there. It makes Goga look good. Jalen Suggs at 7,300. Price tag's getting up there, but he's going to be asked to do more offensively, I would think. They really just don't have a lot going on offensively at this point. From a defensive standpoint, clearly there are guys for him to defend on Milwaukee. If he can avoid foul trouble here, you should see a lot of minutes from him. I projected 34. I would not be surprised at all if he ends up playing more than that. I didn't go above 34 just because, foul trouble does exist. We do see him get in it a decent amount of time for a guard since he is just asked to do so much on ball defensively. 190 minutes this year with no Banchero or Wagner on the floor. Only 0.96 DraftKings points per minute, but does have a 27.5% usage rate, which is basically tied with Cole Anthony for the highest on the team. 18.9% assist percentage, only shooting 26.7% from 3, 0.96 DraftKings points per minute. So basically my takeaway there is what you would expect. You're having Jalen Suggs be asked to do more. he's not very efficient doing it because he's not that type of offensive player. So the upside becomes higher. The median projection doesn't necessarily move a ton just because you are getting that decrease in efficiency. It's not as simple as just saying, oh, Jalen Suggs needs to shoot more. That means he's going to score a bunch more fantasy points. It means he has the opportunity to score a lot more fantasy points, but he's also going to be a bigger focal point for Milwaukee defensively. And he's just not somebody that is typically that level of scorer, but the opportunities will be there. The playing time should be there. And it's a 2-game slate, so he does look pretty good. I like KCP at 4,400. For whatever reason, it just seems like the industry is always low on KCP's minute projection. This guy plays 33, 34 minutes on average in competitive games where he's not in foul trouble. And now you just have more minutes available. He's somebody that can play multiple positions, which is really, really nice. Not only when you're talking about a team like Milwaukee that has, with Middleton back, 3 big scorers that you need to defend, but also when you're talking about an Orlando team that's trying to fill in these Franz Wagner minutes, and you're going to see different rotations potentially than we've seen, last game with Wagner out. It's just very easy for KCP to stay on the floor regardless. If they go small, he shifts to the 3, he's still on the floor. If they play bigger, with De Silva getting more minutes, he's at the 2, he's still on the floor. So whereas, somebody like Cole Anthony, I think could lose minutes here against a bigger Milwaukee team because Wendell Carter Jr. plays more than he did against Phoenix, for example. KCP is playing one way or the other as long as he's not hurt or in foul trouble or something really weird happens. So I like getting him at 4,400. I think the ownership's a little bit too low. I like Wendell Carter Jr. at 5,200, power forward eligibility. I've said several times already that I think Carter plays like normal minutes here. I'm not reading into anything from that last game. I think that he looks good. Could play more than 28 minutes. I didn't go higher than that, but certainly, could be asked to do more. He's only played 34 minutes without Banchero and Wagner on the floor, so nothing to really read into there. Could go back to last season, depending how quickly that loads, and see what he did over that stretch. But, certainly hasn't been a great fantasy producer so far this year, but we know historically he is a pretty solid fantasy producer, and at 5,200, he's just going to look pretty good. So since the start of last season, still only 106 minutes without either one of Franz Wagner or Banchero on the floor, 0.93 DraftKings points per minute, 22.5% usage rate, 14.5% rebounding percentage. That number probably comes down a little bit when you also account for playing minutes alongside Goga as opposed to playing minutes at the 5. But either way, it's basically just a playing time and salary and position thing for Wendell Carter. I think that he looks good. Cole Anthony getting 49% ownership here at 4,200. He's in my highest projected lineup. Like if I were playing cash tonight, I would most likely have Cole Anthony. I still think he projects well, even in the 20 minutes that I gave him. But that is a lot of projected ownership coming into somebody that does have upside because, again, I could be wrong. And Cole Anthony just goes and plays 26 minutes. But also, if I'm right, at 20 minutes, he looks fine. But I could also be wrong in the other direction where let's say that they play Wendell Carter more and they really play Anthony less. Like where I took Caleb Houston out of the rotation. What if Caleb Houston, again, assuming Jonathan Isaac is in, what if Caleb Houston is also in the rotation and Anthony Black kind of just keeps his same role and Anthony barely plays? Like that is something that could happen. I don't think it's the most likely thing at all. I have him at 20 minutes, but there is downside risk in addition to upside for Cole Anthony here. And you get something here where, where Cole Anthony is projected for 49% ownership at $200 less than KCP at, 24% owned. Obviously, Cole Anthony's the higher upside guy. He is probably going to have the highest usage rate on the team outside of maybe Jalen Suggs, but the minutes are really volatile. And if you gave me 2-1 on KCP versus Cole Anthony, I'm taking KCP. You can basically just see I'm handling it in a situation, in a way where I'm playing KCP at a very similar rate to how the field is projected to play Cole Anthony. And then I'm playing Cole Anthony at a pretty close rate to how the field's projected to play KCP. If this ownership holds, I'm perfectly fine with handling it that way because I think that they are similar enough. You can see here that I have them projected almost identically, even though I have Anthony projected for 13 fewer minutes than KCP, 22.3 DraftKings points for KCP, 22.4 for Cole Anthony. When you factor in volatility and all of that, it makes them basically the same play. And KCP is just getting less ownership, so I'm playing more of him. Mo Wagner, right in line with the field there at 5K. If he plays the 20 minutes I projected, you probably don't want him. Obviously, if he plays less than that, you don't want him. But if he's playing well or Goga gets in foul trouble, clearly he gets more minutes and looks really good. It doesn't take a lot for Mo Wagner to look a lot better. And he has been a good actual NBA player this year as well, which helps too. It just makes it easier for Orlando. It makes it easier for him to find ways to stay on the floor for Orlando. Tristan da Silva getting 12% ownership at 3,800. I think he's fine. I'm not getting much, but again, he could play like 26 minutes. I went to 22. Anthony Black, 19% ownership. I'm not really getting there at 4,300. Same kind of thing, I think, where maybe people are just sort of projecting him to play more in line with what he did last game when I took a few minutes off because I think there's going to be some changes to the front court minutes. He's an okay value. Basically, what I assume here is that there's just value from other games that I like more or that project a little bit better for me than these guys. But Black, da Silva, if they're landing in lineups, fine. Jonathan Isaac at 3,900 is a pretty big question mark to me, not only because he's questionable to even play, but if he didn't have the Q tag for his hamstring, hadn't missed a couple games for his hamstring, and it wasn't Jonathan Isaac, I would have projected him for 20 minutes here. And he's a good point per minute guy. The minutes are there for him to just play like every minute behind Wendell Carter Jr., basically like you were seeing from Caleb Houston last game. But I only went to 16 minutes because of his injury history and the fact that I have no idea what they're going to push with him from a hamstring standpoint. They obviously have the bodies where they don't need to do it. So if you guaranteed he played 20 to 22 minutes here, he'd look really good at 3,900. The problem is that he's projected for 17% ownership, and I don't really have any confidence at all that he comes back and Orlando just throws him back into that role, especially because even before the couple games he missed with injury, he had kind of dropped off the playing, he played 9 minutes in a game he was in foul trouble, but also had games where he played like 14 minutes without foul trouble. So obviously those were different rotations. You had Franz Wagner in, but you haven't had a game where Jonathan Isaac actually goes out there and physically plays 20 plus minutes in quite a while, in addition to him with the hamstring injury. He hasn't played north of 20 minutes since November 27th. So I do have some concerns about exactly how many minutes is he going to play. So that's the issue. But if he were to go out there and play a lot, then clearly he would look good. Moving over to the Milwaukee side, where we do also have a different rotation because of Chris Middleton being back. A little surprised at my Milwaukee exposures here. I thought I would have more Bobby Portis, but Giannis, 46% projected ownership. I'm getting to 51%. It's Giannis. He looks really good. To compare him to the other two pay up options you have on this slate, even though we haven't gotten there yet, and I'll talk about it more there, Luka and SGA, clearly those guys look really good as well. All three of them project very similarly for me. It's a very, very difficult matchup for both of those guys. Luka specifically, pretty much everything that he does in terms of play type data on the floor, OKC defends really well and or limits their opponent's opportunities to do it. So Luka clearly projects well. He just doesn't project quite as well for me as he would in a lot of different matchups. So these guys all project similarly. The pricing varies. Luka, I think, is a little bit more expensive than Giannis. And yeah, Luka is $200 more. SGA is a little bit less. So Giannis just looks fine. All three of those guys look very, very similar at the end of the day. Damian Lillard looks really interesting to me at 9K. I like him quite a bit at 24% projected ownership. The matchup overall against Orlando is a tough one. We know that they're good defensively. They have good on-ball defenders in their backcourt in Jalen Suggs and KCP. But Damian Lillard specifically, one of the most pick and roll heavy guards in the league, it's actually not a horrible matchup for him in that regard. So he does actually grade out slightly positive for me when I look at play type data, because from an efficiency standpoint, Orlando has been in the middle of the pack at defending the pick and roll. Points per possession, they're allowing 0.9 points per possession to opposing pick and roll ball handlers. That ranks in the 52nd percentile, 51st percentile in efficiency. So they've been league average, but they've actually allowed, they're in the top 10 in total pick and roll possessions allowed. They are in the top 10 in total points allowed. If you look at field goal attempts allowed 2 pick and roll ball handlers in the top 10 there as well. And then you have Dame, who's just one of the best in the NBA at it. So I think that it's a positive matchup for him just through volume, not necessarily efficiency, because again, Orlando is solid at defending it, but it does look like a pretty interesting spot for Dame. And then just, backing up from that, because I don't want to give the impression that you should just be making plays based off of play type data, which can be noisy and, very nuanced and all of that. It's Damian Lillard on a 2-game slate at 24% ownership and $9,000. That just looks good from an upside standpoint anyway. You can also potentially build some different lineups where, maybe instead of getting like 2 of Giannis SGA, which I think a lot of people are going to do, and that's why you're seeing a lot of ownership come into Jonathan Isaac, Tristan Da Silva, Cole Anthony, Anthony Black, guys like that. You can move away from that tier, go, SGA plus Dame or whatever, and have a little bit more salary to spend elsewhere. So I think that Dame opens up kind of some different roster construction as well. Bobby Portis getting 15% ownership. I'm honestly surprised I don't have more of him. I think that Portis and Lopez are sort of being underprojected in the industry, specifically Portis. The 2 games since Chris Middleton came back. So Bobby Portis' playing time has been all over the place, right? All season long. Very, very difficult to project Bobby Portis's minutes very accurately because it's all over the place. It hasn't been like super matchup dependent as far as he plays more against big front courts. He plays less against small ones or anything like that. Played 31 minutes last game against Brooklyn, played 21 the game before that, 18 before that, 26 before that. Overall, he's averaging 24 minutes per game in his last 5 and for the season, which is a pretty, I think, reasonable place to project him. I ended up going to 25. I gave him an extra minute just because you do have the bigger Orlando front court, which I like. But the other takeaway that I've had from the 2 games that Middleton's been back, when you try and kind of look at patterns and how Doc Rivers is handling these rotations, is that we've, in those 2 games, gotten Milwaukee's front court looking like I talk about a lot with Naz Reid and the Minnesota front court, where Giannis plus Brook Lopez plus Bobby Portis has equaled 96 minutes in both of those games with Middleton back. So I projected 34 minutes to Lopez. I projected 37 minutes to Giannis. If they continue with that, that means 25 minutes for Bobby Portis, where, if Lopez plays less, Portis plays more. If Giannis plays less, Portis plays more. If one or both of Giannis and Lopez play more, Portis plays less. But you haven't been having them give minutes to like Taurean Prince at the 4 to get him more minutes, or Middleton at the 4 or anything like that. You've had kind of those 3 positions contained to each other, and then power forward and center have just been rotated between Lopez, Portis, and Giannis. So I like the playing time potential for Portis here because of that and because of the matchup. Still didn't show up in a ton of lineups for me, but I did think that was interesting to note. Gary Trent Jr. at 3,800, another guy that the playing time is volatile. The performance obviously is volatile and also does impact the playing time, because if Gary Trent's out there knocking down threes, Gary Trent stays on the floor. If Gary Trent is shooting 1 for 8 from 3, Gary Trent goes back to the bench. So projected him for 26 minutes, just still didn't show up in a ton of lineups. Brook Lopez at 5,500, as I mentioned, projected for 34 minutes. I just didn't get him in a ton of lineups still. Chris Middleton's getting some ownership, 12% at 5,900. I get it. It's a 2-game slate. It's Chris Middleton. I do think maybe there is some additional upside in his playing time, but I assume he's somewhat capped here. And so that top end outcome is just really difficult for him to get to. The biggest, I think, positive I could say about him from a playing time standpoint is that in his first game back, he played 23 minutes. In his most recent game, he played 20. The rotations in that 20-minute game were really concerning. He just played 4 separate 5-minute stints, and that gives you basically nothing positive that you can take away if you're trying to make the case for him to play more minutes. Where you can find the positive is that first game back, he played 23 minutes, but he also had as much as like a 7 or 7.5 minute stint. So physically, he went out there and ran around for 7.5 minutes. If you were to just throw him like 4 or 7-minute stints today, he starts to look pretty decent at 5,800 or 5,900. But obviously, I'm not going to project 28 minutes. I went 24. Could make the case for maybe going like 25, 26. But I think 24 is pretty fair given what we saw in that last game, and also trying to account for the fact that he probably doesn't have like 32 minutes in his range, period. So you don't want to like over project, especially if you're using Sims or something. It doesn't understand that Middleton doesn't have Middleton has a unique distribution compared to every other player on this slate other than Jonathan Isaac, basically, in that it's normal to like the downside, but not to the upside. So I think erring on the side of maybe slightly low on Middleton's minutes makes sense. And I'm not getting to him, which again, I'm fine with. If I get burned, if Chris Middleton puts up the game at 5,900 that you have to have, then on to the next one, I guess. But the top end here, I think pretty interesting with Giannis and Dame. Dame in particular, I do really like as a GPP play tonight at that ownership. Now, before we move on to the second game, just a reminder to sign up for Endgame Syndicate using the link in the description below. One of these days, I will remember to actually have the site up and screen share that. But it is the site that I started with Utical, Brick75, and Nerdy Tenor. Our goal over there is to make you better at DFS in a way that is sustainable, that hopefully, long-term cuts down on how much you are paying in subscription fees to a bunch of different places, makes you less reliant on, 100 different tools, teaches you kind of how to build some of your own stuff, the ways that you can maximize things that are publicly available. For example, I use SaberSim as a big part of my process. I have videos out showing exactly how I use it in my day-to-day process. Utical and I have an NBA specific video out talking about things that we look at that we think give us an advantage, including how we use Popcorn Machine, which I was kind of showing on this show, but things we look at in there and some other stuff. Nerdy has stuff out, showing a lot of stuff for battle royales on Underdog, showing a lot of toy game stuff for DFS, how you can think about the relationship that projection and ownership have depending on what contests you're playing, things like that. Brick has similar stuff out as well. And the really nice thing, I think, is that between the four of us, we all approach DFS very differently, and we've all had success in our various ways of doing it. So no matter what your skill set is, no matter how you think about DFS or you want to approach it, there's somebody that speaks your language and that should be able to answer your questions, make you better, and help you, profit more going forward. And that being said, we do also, for members, have a monthly roundtable where we take member questions and we, all four of us, live stream, talk about them, get into detail on that. Our next one is coming up on Thursday night. So great time to sign up now. Also, if you sign up now, there's a pretty decent chance you'll end up getting two of those within a month, because generally we do them at the beginning of the month, and this one is later than usual. So don't know the date that we'll do in January, but there's a decent chance you end up squeezing two of those roundtables out if you catch this one on Thursday. So check that out. Now, moving on to Dallas at Oklahoma City. Najee Marshall, questionable, as I mentioned. PJ Washington, questionable. Maxi Kleba is out. Jaden Hardy is out. The PJ Washington piece is obviously massive. If he were to not play, that would open up a lot of minutes because PJ Washington plays a lot of minutes. I haven't projected in for right now. And then Najee Marshall, if he is out, not as big a deal because at 5,600, I don't think you're really playing much Najee Marshall. But if he is out, it does open up more minutes for Spencer Dinwiddie and potentially Quentin Grimes, who are both $4,100. And they would both go from guys that I think are very difficult to get to right now to guys that still aren't great, but are certainly better than they look if Najee Marshall is in. I'm not getting to a whole lot of Dallas here outside of apparently Daniel Gafford a lot. And I get it. It's risky, but I do think that the upside is there. Now, I do think I'm probably going to end up lowering Gafford's projection a little bit. I was kind of on the fence when I projected this, but you've been getting in competitive games 48 minutes from Gafford plus Lively against OKC. I do think maybe you see that change, and maybe you get some PJ Washington at the 5. So I do think I'm probably going to end up just taking like a minute off Gafford and a minute off Lively, or at least like a minute off Gafford. But either way, the idea with Gafford here is that Lively is starting now. Lively is likely to play the bulk of the minutes. You got 21 minutes from Lively in the last competitive game that Dallas played. But if Lively gets in foul trouble, which he does frequently, or Gafford plays well or whatever, it's basically the same thing that I was talking about with Mo Wagner, where it doesn't take a lot for Daniel Gafford to get more minutes. And if Daniel Gafford gets more minutes at 4,900, then he looks pretty good. So again, I don't think he looks this good, 51% good necessarily, because I do think that I should probably adjust the way that I projected this, especially if Najee Marshall is in, because if Najee Marshall's in, it becomes really easy for Dallas to go small against OKC, where like you have Jalen Williams playing backup center minutes for OKC. It becomes easier for Dallas to counter that with like Najee, PJ Washington, Grimes, Luka, Dinwiddie, or whatever they do. So I do think that cutting back the Gafford projection a little bit is something I'm going to do. But either way, the upside that comes at that salary still applies. So probably not going to be this popular, and it probably does mean I'll be able to get to like some more Brook Lopez too, for example. But I do still think Gafford's a high upside play here, pretty similar to Mo Wagner, just at a little bit cheaper price tag, similar ownership, $100 less expensive. Klay Thompson, Luka Doncic, Derek Lively, PJ Washington, Kyrie, all getting like 20 to 35% ownership here. I'm not getting to them much. I wouldn't be upset if I did. Like, there's nothing wrong with them. I did talk about it a little bit with Luka from a play type standpoint, mentioned it earlier, but Luka, obviously he's Luka, and he does contribute assists. He does contribute rebounding. So keep in mind that when I talk about play type stuff, I'm talking about scoring. I'm not talking about peripheral stats. But when you look at Luka's play type data this year from a frequency standpoint, and then you look at what OKC does, 16 to 17% of Luka's possessions this year have been in isolation, 16% in transition, 38% in the pick and roll, and then just like sub 5% in a bunch of other shit. OKC, I don't remember. I looked at it before the show. I don't remember the specific stats, but in all three of those things that I mentioned, OKC is basically like top 10 in efficiency and bottom 10 in possessions allowed. So they're limiting it and they are defending it well. And that's not surprising given how well coached of a team this is and how good they are defensively, the length that they have. You have Caruso back now too. So like if Lou Dort gets in foul trouble defending Luka, it's not as big an advantage because now you're just going to throw Alex Caruso at him. So Luka is still one of the highest projected guys on the slate. Like I think I have SGA, Luka, and Giannis within like a point of each other. But I do think that this is a particularly difficult scoring matchup for Luka, which maybe he just scores anyway because he's Luka. He's certainly going to try, or maybe he just gets 20 assists or something. But so I don't want it to come off as he's a bad play, but I do think the fact that he's getting this much ownership at a slightly more expensive price tag than Giannis, a more expensive price tag than SGA, 2,300 more than Dame on a slate where I don't love a ton of the value. I think that's kind of just costing me some Luka. Klay Thompson, 4,600, pretty cheap price tag. Could certainly see a couple more minutes here than he's played recently, as he kind of like works his way back from missing time with the, I think, plantar fasciitis issue. PJ Washington, 6,600, Kyrie, 8,300. All these guys are fine, but at the same time, I think I projected them pretty well. Like I went 27 minutes to Klay. I went 39 minutes to Luka. I went 26 to Lively. I went 35 to Washington. I went 37 to Kyrie. I don't think I underprojected these guys. So the fact that I'm not getting to them just kind of, it's scary. And if I rerun everything before lock and I have them, I'm not going to be mad about having Luka or Kyrie or whatever. But I also, this is the kind of thing, where people kind of ask me questions about curating my player pool and, trying to get quote unquote overweight or underweight on guys. When I see something like this, like with Gafford, I say, okay, I know I was probably a little bit aggressive going 22 minutes. I don't want 50% of Gafford just because I overprojected him by a minute or two. So I'm going to dial that back. But then I see like Luka and I'm like, okay, I projected him for 39 minutes. If I project him for 39 minutes and I'm not getting to him, I'm just not getting to him today. And that's fine. So, that's kind of how I approach that is I'm confident in the way I projected these guys. And so I'm going to just roll with what my full process gives me, with the exception here of Gafford, who I wasn't super confident in the way I projected him. And I don't want this much of him, given the fact that I know I was probably a little bit high on my projection. If I cut him to 20 minutes and get 50%, couldn't care less. I'll play 50% Gafford is basically how I approach that. Travis said, if PJ is out, would you play Prosper? It depends. I think I haven't projected yet for that case. If Najee's in and PJ's out, I still don't think Prosper plays enough because I think the combination of Grimes and Najee would pick up the bulk of those minutes. I also think that you would then get probably for sure 48 minutes combined from Lively and Gafford. If Najee is out and PJ is out, maybe. I still don't know that he plays enough to like really matter, especially against OKC, because you can realistically just like get Clay at the 4 in a lot of cases, I think, where like it's Kyrie, Dinwiddie, Grimes, Clay, and a center or something. Luka, Kyrie, Dinwiddie, like 3-guard group, and then Clay or Grimes. So like if they're both out, I think Prosper plays. I'm not positive he plays enough that I would really want him outside of just dart throw, large field stuff. Jake said, what do we think about playing Goga and Wagner together in the same lineup? I don't care. Like it's a 2-game slate. It's obviously not ideal, and there is absolutely negative correlation there because they're unlikely to share the floor much, if at all. But it's a 2-game slate, and like you could just get 28 minutes for Goga, 20 for Wagner. Wagner smashes 5K, or even if he doesn't smash 5K, he's better at 5K than like the other options. And then Goga does really well at 5,400. Like they're cheap enough that if they showed up, it's okay. But I certainly don't think I'd be getting a lot of it just because they do negatively correlate. And in general, like if I have Goga, I would rather have $5,500 Brook Lopez because he doesn't negatively correlate. Alex said, you have a problem with playing Giannis and Dame together? No, not at all. Generally, I don't have any problem with playing two guys that share the floor because while you can get the negative correlation of, there's only one basketball, you also get the positive stuff where if the game's played at a faster pace than usual, they both benefit. If the game goes to overtime, they both benefit. You get stuff like that. But then also in the case of Giannis and Dame specifically, Giannis will grab a bunch of rebounds. Dame scores. And so like they don't necessarily overlap in stats either. The biggest concern you would have is if they both have big games, does Orlando keep up, which is a legitimate concern, but also it's a 2-game slate. So if Milwaukee like really blows out Orlando and you only get 3 quarters from Giannis and Dame, if it's like 50 points for Dame and 58 points for Giannis, there's still a decent chance that like that's a winning combo. And that's kind of like the worst case scenario, probably if they only play 3 quarters kind of thing. So I don't have any issue with that. Dangerous Dave said Portis or Lopez. Portis broke 40 DraftKings points last time out. He played 31 minutes last time out, so that's not what I'm projecting here. I do have a little bit more Portis. I think that the power forward eligibility just opens things up a little bit more for him. I think that they're both fine, but I did, at least in the lineups I ran before the show, have a little bit more Portis. And wrapping things up with the OKC side, getting tons and tons and tons of Alex Caruso. He'd be my highest owned guy if the slate started right now. This is probably another reason that I'm just not getting much of the like Jonathan Isaac, Tristan Da Silva, whatever other cheap guys that I wasn't getting to. This is one reason why. It's just Caruso fits in shooting guard and small forward slots, so it's really easy to get him into lineups. I'm also pretty bullish on the playing time here. I only projected 24 minutes, which is what he played last game. But this is like the ideal Alex Caruso picks up more minute spot against a Dallas backcourt that has Luka and Kyrie. You probably get more minutes from him, like I said before, if Dort gets in foul trouble. But either way, you could very easily see him just play more minutes here. Wouldn't be surprising at all if he closes over Case and Wallace like he did last game. So I think Caruso looks really, really good, basically at his floor price tag and in a spot where it would be really unusual, surprising for him not to play at least like mid-20s in minutes. So he looks really good. I like SGA a lot as well. He looks like he's probably going to be my highest owned of those 3 pay-up guys, which isn't surprising because he's $1,100 less than Giannis. He's $1,300 less than Luka, and I have him projected the same as those guys, which, again, my projection on Luka is lower than a lot of the industry. Industry consensus is that Luka is the highest projected guy, which, again, it's Luka. I can't argue with that too much, but I do hate the actual matchup for Luka, and so it did drop my projection on him a little bit to where all 3 of these guys are pretty much the same to me. And that gets me more of SGA and Giannis. Jalen Williams, pretty much in line with the field there at 8,700, likely to give you 35 minutes or so. Keep in mind with these OKC guys, they do benefit a little bit here, and it's why they're showing up so much, both for me and the field. OKC plays a lot of blowouts, and they typically have a pretty deep rotation. And so as a result, you get a little bit lower salaries on their main pieces, and then you get them thrown into a game like this where it's very likely to be a competitive game. They want to win the game. They're likely to be playing it, more like a playoff game than a regular season game. And so then you're getting, a 37-minute projection for SGA, whereas his normal projection is 34 or 35. You're getting like a 35-minute projection on Jalen Williams when his normal projection is 32 or 33. So it just is going to make their main pieces look a little bit more underpriced than some other teams where their starters normally play really big minutes. Lou Dort, 4,400, looks very good at 40%. Should be on the floor as much as he can against Luka. Foul trouble, obviously a legitimate risk here. Projected 32 minutes, but really if he doesn't get in foul trouble, I wouldn't be surprised if he played more than that. So I don't think that's, too aggressive of a projection. Aaron Wiggins is just a fuck it, why not? I don't know why Aaron Wiggins is showing up. Like, I projected him for 17 minutes. He's projected for 20% ownership. He's 3,500. It's got to just be a price thing, and the fact that there is a lot of volatility in Aaron Wiggins minutes, which is nice. But certainly if I lost some of this Aaron Wiggins and it did become Tristan Da Silva, Jonathan Isaac, whoever else, Gary Trent, nothing wrong with that. I think I would actually prefer it. There's nothing about Aaron Wiggins that I'm looking at and saying, oh yeah, I think this is an Aaron Wiggins spot. Like I think it is an Alex Caruso spot or anything. So that, I could certainly take it or leave it. 7,100 for Hartenstein. We saw him play like 32 or 33 minutes a handful of games ago, and then he's kind of just gotten settled into like the 32-minute range. I projected 32 here because of the game. Wouldn't be shocked if he played a little bit more. Obviously could play a little bit less. Cason Wallace, I'm right around the field. I'm assuming he starts. I don't think he closes, though he could, but I assume Alex Caruso closes over him. So I projected like 26 minutes to Wallace. Just makes him look fine at 3,900. Isaiah Joe only played 14 minutes last game. It's an OKC bench piece. He can play anywhere from like 24 to 14 minutes. At 3,400, I think that looks fine. You're just kind of hoping he gets hot. Somebody mentioned AJ Mitchell. I'm concerned on his minutes because of the game. He has been playing a good amount lately. And so, yeah, at 3,100, maybe he plays 18 minutes and looks pretty good. He's not getting any ownership. So if you want to take that chance, fine. But I only projected him to play 11 minutes. I projected him as the backup to SGA and nothing else. And it's just a situation where if you go through and actually map out the minutes that people are playing and where they're playing them, it just becomes hard to find the minutes for Mitchell unless you're taking minutes away from Caruso or Dort or something like that. And I'm not doing that. So he kind of just became in a playoff type rotation. I think this is the guy that kind of gets squeezed out. Same for Kenrich Williams, who I only gave like 8 minutes to. I think that Jalen Williams picks up, more minutes behind Hartenstein than typical, and that kind of cuts into Kenrich. So those were the two that I kind of like phased out. And then I still assume that Aaron Wiggins has that same sort of volatility that he normally does. I assume Isaiah Joe still has that same sort of minutes volatility that he normally does. So that's how I projected it. But if you disagree, then yeah, 2% owned AJ Mitchell. Sure, take shots if you think he's going to play like 5-6 minutes alongside SGA. I just don't anticipate that happening. Antoine Murphy said, why are people so high on OKC and not the Mavs? So the field is higher on the Mavs than I am. But in general, I think it's just pricing. Like if you compare the prices here, the highest projected guy on OKC is 10K. The highest projected guy on Dallas is 11.3. Caruso's 3,700. You don't really have those pieces on Dallas because Dinwiddie's up to 4,100. Clay, while he's cheap for what Clay can do, Clay's only 4,600. You just have all these like sub 4K guys in the rotation on OKC. Lou Dort similarly priced to Clay. You can make the lower owned pivot argument for Clay, but Dort is pretty clearly going to project for more minutes when we've had Clay, somewhat limited in his return. So that's why you're seeing more ownership, or at least for me, more exposure come into OKC, and then more ownership in general for the field come into OKC. It's just the pricing versus Dallas. So that's an hour or 40 minutes, 50 minutes, whatever it was, on 2 games. Thank you for checking out the show. Hit the thumbs up button. Appreciate that a lot. Don't forget to sign up for Endgame Syndicate. We have the roundtable coming up on Thursday, answering whatever DFS questions that you have. Other than that, I'll be back here at the same time tomorrow, talking about tomorrow's 2 games. Thanks, Dan, for checking out the show. Good luck on your lineups tonight, and I'll see you back here tomorrow.